My name is Adnan Fakir. I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Western Australia, and I'm here to present a joint work with two of my colleagues. One of them is from IFPRI, another one is from North South University in Bangladesh. And we have been thinking about working on the effect of smoking on agricultural productivity, and the evidence is actually from rural Bangladesh. So I'll go ahead and start with the presentation. Thank you for having me here, and it's great to see all of you. Okay, so the motivation behind the paper is really that there's a high global cost of smoking, and the World Health Organization links that to about $1.4 trillion. This is US dollars, and this is from a paper in 2016 where they include the opportunity cost as well. So lost productivity due to deaths or diseases are also included in this number. Now, what's interesting is that 80% of the smokers in the world reside in mostly LMICs. So among the top 5 countries, Bangladesh is there. So the average smoking rate of men is about 37%, whereas globally it's about 31%. So on top of that, the poorest quintile, so the poor people are twice as more likely to smoke than the wealthiest quintile. Okay, so the reason why we focus on smoking here is because there is a high correlation between physically demanding jobs such as farming or day laborers and smoking as well. So we were thinking that we were looking for studies that compared especially agricultural workers who smoke and who do not smoke, and the question was that whether there is a linkage between that or not. Do farmers who smoke end up with lower agricultural productivity through its labor impact than people who do not, than farmers who do not? Okay, and this is especially relevant for the case of Bangladesh because 40% of the labor force is employed as farmers in agriculture, and 60% of the land is arable, whereas 71% is allocated for agricultural uses. So with that research question in mind, we first wanted to look at, let's look at the costs and benefits related to smoking. The benefits are not many, and I think we all know that it's some of it is doubted, but there are studies that have tried to show that. So that's the counter argument to smoking. So Eichmann et al. In 2010 did a meta study of 41 lab studies and showed that smoking did improve fine motor skills, alertness, attention, accuracy, response time, and working memory for the participants, but this was within a very short time span. There are also subjective benefits to smoking that include stimulation, stress relief, and reduced hunger. And when we do a qualitative assessment of our farmers, they also report similar things, and we'll get to that. But I think the most benefit, especially in rural areas in Bangladesh, from smoking comes from the peer group participation. Smokers tend to form a network, and that's how usually informations are spread from one farmer to another, from one participant to another. So what happens is that all the farmers usually get together in tea stalls in these rural areas, and they smoke, and then the chat and information is spread in that manner. So there is a group participation aspect from it that infers like social benefits. The negative costs of smoking are, we all know about this. So we all know that it causes lung and heart diseases. That's been shown over and over again. However, at the same time, some studies also report reduced stamina, especially for young workers. And that is especially relevant in our case because we're going to look at labor input and how that affects agricultural productivity. Other studies, especially related to blue-collar work, have also shown higher absenteeism, presenteeism, and longer sick leaves during work. Some studies have also concluded that there is a wage penalty for smokers relative to non-smokers, and this can vary between 5% to 24%. None of the studies, however, I should point out, are linked to agricultural activity, but rather these are mostly blue-collar industrial work. Okay, so there is lower long-run earnings over the lifetime. Now, where do we get the data from? So we collect primary data from, as part of the Chars Tobacco Assessment Project, which was done in 2019. So the primary data was collected from 985 households from 24 riverine islands in Gaibandha district in rural northern Bangladesh. I'll explain what riverine islands are in a bit. The reason why we do use this data is because we collect primary data, a lot of detailed data on agricultural production of the last production cycle. But more importantly, we collect smoking behavior data, specifically breath carbon monoxide readings. So we collect that using a smoke analyzer machine that gives us the carbon monoxide levels in your breath, and that is accurate up to the past 12 hours. Okay, so these readings were collected between 4 and 6 p.m. From the farmers. So from here, from the 985 households, we have 401 primary farmers, where 82% were current smokers. So there was a very high rate of smoking in the Gaibandha Chars, which is also why we decided to collect the primary data from there. So what are these riverine islands, or what we call locally as Chars? So these are islands in a very small masses of land in a river, but there are so many of them, and Bangladesh is highly densely populated, that it covers actually a span of 4 million people over the country. We focus on specifically the Gaibandha district. The characteristic is that there is a high risk of land erosion and flooding. It's home to predominantly poor households because there are no land rights there. There is low literacy, limited access to electricity, and contact with mainland. Solar electricity is the one that's usually prevalent there because there are no electricity lines that run to the riverine islands. What's important is that a lot, like Bangladesh is a land where NGOs, non-government organizations work a lot, right? So, but in these Char areas, very few NGOs actually work. So there is a low exposure to anti-tobacco and health awareness campaigns. Because of that, tobacco companies, especially the British American tobacco, BAT, enjoys a high degree of penetration within these Chars. And there's low compliance with national regulations as well. So these are some photos from the study area. So this is a typical Char where we have there, and in the upper left photo, the higher land areas where the houses are, and the lower land area is usually underwater, but we went there during the dry season, so the water wasn't there, and that's when most of the farming takes place. Typical crops include jute, paddy, peanuts, spices, and so on. Okay. So when we were collecting data, we also did a few FGDs and semi-structured interviews, and we wanted to get the farmers' viewpoint towards smoking and their productivity. So the majority of the farmers reported that believe that smoking increases their productivity. And one of the reasons they cited is because they have to do quite a bit of waterlogged cultivation, especially in terms of jute. And they believe that smoking increased their body temperature. They also said that it alleviates boredom while doing repetitive tasks, and they were aware of the health costs of smoking, but we don't think they were really salient about it. Okay, so just a quick overview of the statistics. Farmers and non-farmers were on average of the similar age. However, smokers tended to have lower levels of education, and they also tended to be more underweight slightly. Okay, and they also came from households with lower wealth quintiles. So those aspects are there. So those differentiations between smokers and non-smokers are there. We know that the normal BMI is the one that's statistically significantly different between the two groups. In terms of agricultural production, smokers tended to operate in larger farm areas. So the land size were larger than non-smokers, 0.7 acres as opposed to 0.58. Also, they put in a lot more family labor hours compared to non-smokers. Also, they spent less behind capital and inputs such as seeds and fertilizers, but they spent a lot more behind pesticides. Once again, the sample size isn't that large, but that's what we have right now. So overall, what happened is the value of output per acre in Bangladeshi taka per acre was actually higher for smokers than non-smokers. Okay, so with this in mind, let's move on to the empirical framework that we use. So if we first start off using a Cobb-Douglas production function, and so the Cobb-Douglas production function is fairly straightforward. We model it as follows. Y is the monetary value of the output. Fj is the effective family labor. H is the hired family labor hours. Kj is the cost of capital. Z is the size of the agricultural land that they're producing on. And U, V, and W are basically the costs of seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides, respectively. So what we do is we follow Dio Laliker in his seminal paper from Aristat, where he showed how calorie intake and nutrition can become a part of the agricultural production function. And we follow a similar empirical framework to model smoking behavior. So we say that effective family labor is going to come into the production function as such. So as first, effective family labor is basically a function of the total family labor hours, and smoking comes up on top. So it's an exponent, so it's 1 plus tau Sj, where Sj is the binary indicator for the farmer smoking status, and the tau is the parameter of interest. So when we put this back into the production function, the farmer's production function essentially becomes this, and that's related to the Cobb-Douglas function that we have there. So once we have that, we take a log on both sides, and we end up with a nonlinear function. And once again, the target is to estimate the tau, and we use nonlinear least squares because we believe there is an endogeneity problem here, which we'll talk about in a bit. But the idea is from this model, we can differentiate, we'll partial differentiate Yj with respect to LF, and we'll end up getting the effective family labor elasticity of output from here. So that's the approach, econometric approach we'll be taking. The advantage with tau is because the way tau enters the equation, from here we can assess what effect smoking has on agricultural productivity through effective family labor. So if tau is 0, there is no effect. If it's greater than 0, it increases agricultural productivity of effective family labor. If it's less than 0, but greater than -1, it reduces agricultural productivity. And if it's -1, it pushes the production function into the region of negative marginal product from effective family labor effort. So that's these are the testable hypotheses that we have. Now, there are selection issues. We already saw that smokers do differ, and they may differ from non-smokers in some unobserved factors that can be associated with productivity. So there's a endogeneity here. And literature already shows that smokers do tend to have higher discount rates, and they may be more risk-loving. Okay, so some studies have accounted for endogeneity of smoking before, specifically Old and Luxin and Beagle, when they're calculating the wage penalty of smoking, and they're mixed results here because they find that smoking increases after accounting for endogeneity, whereas Lyon, Hirschberg, and Yuda find insignificant effects. So then the question is, what do we use as the instrument? That's where the carbon monoxide readings come in. So what we use are average char level carbon monoxide readings minus the individual, so that we have some intra-char variation. So we're excluding the individual in question and taking the jar average except of him. And we use that as a proxy for the peer effect of smoking. Smoking, a lot of studies, and it's in fact quite common, that smoking behavior also depends on your surrounding environment. If more people smoke around you, there's a stronger peer effect, and it's likely that you will pick up smoking as well. So the relevance criteria is sort of satisfied from there. It's also linked to the notion that Rice and Sutton and Taylor also talks about, that if you're deviating from the perceived group norms, that can be socially penalizing. So that's the idea behind it. However, we argue that the average char level carbon monoxide concentration should not directly affect an individual's agricultural output. And that's the argument we put forward related to the exclusion restriction. In fact, this instrument has been previously used by Lokshin and Beagle as well. So using that, we run a nonlinear two-stage estimation, and we get a tau parameter of -0.30 when we include individual controls. The regressions also have crop and char fixed effects, and the F-stat, the first stage F-stat is roughly 42. So it's greater than 40. So from here, what does this tau value of -0.3 roughly indicate? So it tells us that smoking by the lead farmer reduces productivity of the effective family labor by roughly 38 to 32%. What does that mean in terms of elasticity? It means that smokers, non-smokers, while they have an effective family labor elasticity to output of 0.17, For smokers, the elasticity is reduced to roughly 0.12. So output becomes less responsive to changes in family labor effort. I should mention here that over the last 2-3 days, we have sort of run a robustness check using a CES translog production function as well. We get slightly higher estimates of the elasticity in that. I couldn't include that in the presentation because it was so recent, but we get estimates of roughly 37 to 39% using a CES translog production function. Now, of course, this has a lot of limitations. For example, we did not have data on the smoking status of hired labor. In other words, or other family members, for example, the children who also work on the fields. So since we do not have that smoking status, we can have biases through beta 1 or beta 2. The other thing is that the data is representative only of the Chars. There is no external validity. And we're also unable to decompose the effect. In other words, we don't know whether this loss in, this reduction in elasticity is due to worsening health from smoking, or is it due to behavioral traits associated with smoking, such as absenteeism or presenteeism. So we are unable to decompose that effect. In conclusion, the adverse effect of smoking does lead to lost productivity in terms of agricultural output, and it is economically significant. One of the policy prescriptions that can happen, especially in agrarian countries such as Bangladesh, to improve labor productivity is to actively target the smoking behavior of agricultural households. And we believe that is something that the government can start looking into. That's it from me. Thank you so much. Any and all questions are welcome. And I would love to have feedback because this is a very work in progress. Thank you.